Hello friends and lovers, and welcome to my Hades 2 god tier list, and this is for the Warsong update where they just introduced Aries to us. So we have a new god to compare and contrast to the rest here, and it's a good time to update a tier list like this, right? And I should preface this video by saying I'm not going to worry too much about the rankings of them. This is sort of just a format slash excuse to discuss the gods, compare and contrast, and, talk about their strengths and where they're best. That's usually the kind of thing. All the gods really have a place where they shine, at least. And that's sort of why I got rid of the D tier, because it just doesn't really seem necessary to have that many tiers for gods that are relatively all around the same strength. I think the game is surprisingly well balanced. Nevertheless, some could be improved. I do think so, but let's talk about it. All right, so we're just going to go from left to right here. Basically, this tier list had Artemis and Hermes in here, but we're not actually going to rank them because it doesn't really make sense to rank them when they don't give any core boons, for instance. Maybe I'll talk about Hermes at least, you know what I mean? But that would be about it. But let's talk about Poseidon a little bit. So Poseidon, how do I feel about Poseidon? I feel okay about Poseidon is what I would say. And you might get shocked a little bit to see where I'm going to place him right away here. In fact, maybe it's best to place him right at the forefront in the bottommost tier. And again, don't focus too much on the rankings, but let's just talk about his use cases. So Poseidon is a god where he's great for a fast or rapid hitting weapon if you take his attack or special. So if you're going to hit very rapidly with the attack, he's going to do amazingly well if you put his attack boon there. Same thing with the special, rapid hitting special, boom. And then you'll probably want to get a lot more Poseidon boons after that if you do go that route with a rapid hitting weapon, because his legendary is quite strong. I would say he's got a couple decent follow-up boons. He's got he's got a couple of decent duo boons for the splash effect as well. He starts to fall off when you look at pretty much everything else. Like if you're not going to focus on his attack or special, or start there, I should say, and you think about other things like his cast, his dash, his magic regen, and his most of his other supplemental boons, they're just not very strong, I'm afraid. They're just not very useful. There's not a lot of use cases for them, you know? And let's say I'm not starting with Poseidon. I'm starting with pretty much literally any other god. How happy am I to see Poseidon appear in my run as the second, third, or fourth god, basically? And the truth is, not happy at all. He kind of just doesn't fit in after that. You think about his supplemental boons. When I say supplemental, I mean the boons that can kind of complement any build that doesn't necessarily require a lot more Poseidon. He's got a boon like Hydraulic Might. It's okay. Buried Treasure, which just kind of gives you money. Yeah, it's not very good. He does have Geyser Spout, which is very nice and unique for a cast build. I actually really like that one, I will say. He's got a boon called Depth Charge. It's horrible. It's horrible. It doesn't look that bad, but it is horrible. He does have Sea Star, which is a fun boon, but most of the time, it's not going to be a great boon. Even if you find it early, that boon suffers from, if it's the second half of your run and you're getting it, it feels really bad to get because you're not going to benefit from it. That's the one that can potentially duplicate things like max health and a palm. So I think that's the biggest problem with Poseidon. It's either an all Poseidon run or a no Poseidon run, and I find myself doing no Poseidon runs more than anything else. So poor Poseidon winds up in the C tier, I'm afraid. Let's move on to Apollo here, and Apollo isn't getting a ton better, truth be told. I found myself not really wanting his attack or special almost ever. And he kind of suffers from the same thing that Poseidon does, which is that he doesn't apply a curse with his attack or special natively, so you'd have to get something else most of the time. You require two boons. Nevertheless, I think he does win out on Poseidon for some other reasons. I find myself using Apollo a little bit more often, I think, there, or at least I'm a little bit happier to see him. At least you can grab his cast or his dash to apply a curse, and thus you can get Origination going. Origination is the Arcana card that allows you to deal 50% more damage to enemies that have 2 or more curses on them. So at least Apollo has that. Also, Apollo's legendary is really, really fun. It's the one that doubles your Omega attack and special, so it triggers 2 times. It does cost more magic, but it's just so much fun. It's not always the most useful thing or the most logical thing to aim for in a run, but it's just so much fun. It's just such a great thing to have in the game that doubles up something like that. You want to have these crazy combos, even if it is a lot of work, I think. So I like Apollo existing for that. I think his magic regen, Lucid Gain, is quite good overall, too. Not the best, but it's strong. It's good enough, I'd say. It definitely has lots of use cases. Some use cases, at least, I think that maybe might be the bottom line, is how many use cases are there for something like that. His supplementary boons. You got things like extra dose, chance to trigger your attack boons more often. You have perfect image, where you deal more damage if you have not taken any damage yourself for a while. Probably something else that I can't quite think of there. Yeah, I think that's fine for Apollo. I don't find myself using his attack or special very often, like I said, just because I think he gets outclassed by the next god, which we can talk about right now, I suppose, which is Aphrodite. So yeah, Aphrodite has a higher percentage for attack and special boons than Apollo does, but Apollo gives a greater range to those moves, essentially. But your mileage will vary depending on the weapon and aspect that you're using. Will that additional range, quote unquote, actually do anything? It just really depends on what you're using, sadly. And thus, I find myself, if I am going to take a god who just increases my attack or special damage, no fluff, that's all they do, then I would probably choose Aphrodite instead. And I think she belongs in A tier for more reasons than just that. She does have the highest percentage attack and special boon. I think her cast is quite strong, actually. It applies weak to enemies and sucks them all into the center of the cast. I think it's actually really, really good. Her dash is trash, basically. It's not really one that I'd want to take. And her magic regen is mediocre, I think. Glamour gain, it applies weak to enemies nearby, which is okay, but it just often doesn't generate enough magic, I think, if you're using an Omega heavy build. So it kind of gets stuck in this weird place, It's not enough magic if you're spamming your Omegas, and then if you're not using your Omegas, like, at all, then it's probably going to deactivate the Huntress Arcana card for you, because you're going to slowly regen your magic if you purposely use some to activate the Huntress, unfortunately, right? So I think her magic regen is kind of personally. I know, a lot of people tell me free origination. Origination isn't that hard if you plan around it that much, but yeah, I get it. Her supplementary boons are really, really good, though. Namely, Shameless Attitude, aka Shatitude. So it gives you, I think at Epic, it's like plus 14% damage to everything. And it's double if you're over, I forget now, 80% health or something like that. So possibly up to 28% more damage on everything. It's really good. It's really, really good. She's got boons like Secret Crush, which give you power on your attack. It's pretty good. Obviously, you need to be using your attack a lot. Just Life Affirmation, I don't find myself taking that very often, though. She has the Heartbreaker stuff, which is when you spend enough magic, you spawn a little heartthrob around Mel, and you can ram that into enemies. And there's some duo boons around that. I think that's like a really fun mechanic in the game to have, even if it's not always suitable for a particular build, but it's just like a fun option to have out there. So I think she does pretty well for herself. I think she's got a lot of good things. I'm usually happy to see Aphrodite on a door if I'm doing pretty much any run, basically, is what I would say. Speaking of which, of even stronger gods, we're somehow going up the ranks very narrowly here, I would say. We now have Hera. Hera is a really interesting god, and I think some people don't know how to feel about her. I think her hitch effect is a lot stronger than some people give it credit for. So her hitch effect will make it so enemies kind of share damage. You apply hitch to, say, 3 different enemies. They will then share the damage you deal to any one of them a little bit, to some degree or another. It's the best way I can describe it. It's kind of similar to Aspect of Rama and Hades 1, if that helps you at all. It's just a good way to kind of deal group damage, especially if you wouldn't otherwise have that option, if that makes any sense. You might find a way to kind of spread the damage that you're dealing around to deal with groups of enemies with that. Plus, it's just a curse at the end of the day, and it's a pretty good curse. I think it's a good curse that has more function. Whereas, for instance, the weak effect from Aphrodite, I don't really care about the actual weak effect. It makes enemies deal less damage. I don't care about that. I very rarely even think about that aspect of it. I just like that I have a curse for origination to deal more damage. So I like curses that allow me to deal more damage, if that makes more sense. And Hitch does that, basically. So I think the Hitch effect is quite powerful. So her attack, her special, even her cast, which is a bit odd, I'll say, but nevertheless, it applies Hitch, so I think it's okay, at least. Her dash is trash, also, I'm afraid. And then you got her magic regen. It is the best in the game by far. It's not even close. It is not even close. It's called Born Game. Every time you use up all your magic, you prime some amount and you refill your magic bar. And it just gives you an effective magic pool of insane amounts. You know, you don't it's just absolutely out of control how much magic you can get from that. And it's super easy. You never have to think about her magic regen. What you'll see with the other gods often is you have to think about how to get that magic back. You have to kind of do just a little bit of work. I know you have to do a little bit of work, and maybe that's should be the game philosophy, that you need to manage your magic instead of just set it and forget it, which is what Hera does. But nevertheless, the best is the best, right? So she's definitely got the best one, you know? Supplementary boons. She has a new one called Extended Family, which is really nice. It increases your Olympian damage for every god that you have, which would include gods like Hermes, Artemis, Athena, Dionysus, by the way. That might be really confusing, and it's hard for me to get into all of it, but I guess the best way to explain it is it will increase the damage of anything that has a flat amount listed on the boon. When I say flat amount, I mean not a percentage, so it won't increase your Aphrodite attack boon, for instance, or the damage of any of your attack boons. But if you have Poseidon's attack boon that deals splash damage, it'll increase the damage of the splash effect specifically. Hope that makes sense. It pairs really well with Zeus's boons, or the blitz damage, what I should say there. And speaking of which, maybe I should probably do them together because it kind of makes sense. They have a really cool interaction going on. They each have a unique duo between each other, Queen's Ransom and King's Ransom, that will boost. It will delete the boons of the other god and boost the boons of the god that you chose the duo for. Queen's Ransom will give +4 palms to all of your Hera boons for each Zeus boon that gets deleted in your inventories. I hope I explained that well enough in case you don't know the boons that well. And I think that's not always the most useful, but it is just a really, really fun thing to have in the game to really aim for and just get, like, 24 palms on some boons. It's just so much fun to be able to do that. And it's really strong sometimes too, depending on how you work on it, I think it is actually really, really strong. Why don't we finish off the top with Hera, though? For supplementary boons, what else does she have off the top of my head that I can think of? I know she's got at least something else here. If I can think of it, well, it doesn't matter. I think she does belong in S. I think she does, just because Hitch is good, Extended Family's good. Okay, she does have boons like Uncommon Grace. She's got a really cool boon called Fine Line, where every time you use an Omega, you get like this kind of crackle of lightning across the screen. It does make your Omegas cost more, but there's some really cool combinations with it that make it a lot of fun. I think she belongs in S, not because she's, like the Hitch is crazy powerful. I think it has more to do with she has a lot of use cases. Possibly just because of Born Gain. If you're using any amount of magic in your run, you're probably going to want to see Hera, so I think she winds up belonging in S tier. I do like a lot of our duo boons, too. I think a lot of them are quite interesting. Can't get into all of them right now for this, but we can talk about the Zeus one, and Zeus is the king right now. Possibly not so different from Hades 1. Zeus was almost certainly the strongest god in Hades 1 if we were forced to pick one. He just has so many use cases right now. So why is Zeus so strong right now in Hades 2? Well, he got even better with the Warsong update because they made it so that Blitz, the curse that Zeus gives you, will trigger no matter what now. So it used to be you had to deal a certain amount of damage to actually trigger the Blitz damage that you would be applying to enemies. You had to deal like 120 damage to make the Blitz deal the damage. Now it'll just happen at the end no matter what. Basically, Blitz is doomed from Hades 1 now. But you can also trigger it faster manually by dealing a bunch of damage to the enemies that have Blitz on them. So it's just incredibly strong. So Zeus's attack and special, incredibly strong because it has Blitz. His cast is insanely strong for single target damage. His dash is trash. His magic regen is fine. It's not bad, I think. You have to do a little bit more work than some others, but it's just fine. His supplementals are absolutely insane. You got boons like Static Shock, that prime some magic and let you deal chain lightning damage. It's just really, really, really good. And then you got a lot of great tier 2 boons too. So if you do get his attack, for instance, then you can get Double Strike, which gives you a chance to just double that lightning damage. And then we can segue into King's Ransom, and you can buff all those boons by deleting your Hera boons and get insane numbers. You know, he is easily the best way to deal a lot of damage in Hades 2 right now, and I don't think it's exceptionally close. You know, he doesn't have a use case everywhere, and Blitz doesn't necessarily pop off in every single scenario, I guess you could say, but he's the closest thing to kind of fitting in every single hole right now is how I would describe it, though. All right, next up we got Hephaestus. This is interesting because, truth be told, I don't use Hef's attack or special boons very commonly. Hef, not too dissimilar to Poseidon, you're either doing an all Hef build or, well, I wouldn't say a no Hef build, because it's his supplementaries that really pull him way above some of the other gods here, I think. But the point is, I won't usually take his attack or special, the Kling Clang stuff, unless I'm kind of just having a fun run, you know? I don't see a lot of great uses for it. And not to mention, his attack and special are super reliant on a high rarity. So if I get like an epic offered, it's like, okay, sure, I'll take it, you know? Not to mention, it also doesn't apply a curse, which means that it just doesn't always fit in. You have to get a second boon for that to happen. And 2 boons to get a curse is kind of like, yeah, I don't know how I feel about that. But it's the supplementals that really make Hef, namely the boon's mint condition that makes you impervious for the first 7 to 9 seconds, I think, depending on the rarity, when you start an encounter. It's incredibly strong defensive boon. Then you get Trusty Shield, prime some magic, it gives you some armor at the start of every encounter. It's just, again, super strong defensively, helps you skate by at those higher difficulties, gives you a big safety net. So Hef is always a great god to take for your 3rd or 4th god, basically, out of the 4 you'll probably get in a run. He's just absolutely amazing to fill in that last slot. After you already have filled in, like, your attack, your special, your cast, and all that stuff, and that way he's only going to show you those supplementals, too. I think it's just really good. Therefore, because I pretty much want to see him almost every single run, he winds up being surprisingly high up here, you know what I mean? Because if you're just trying to win, the strategy is to basically take his keepsake in the 3rd biome, whether you're going the surface or the underworld right now, probably. And even if you already have 4 different gods in your build, he just fits, you know what I mean? It's crazy when you think about it. Maybe too good in some ways. To talk a little bit more, his cast is kind of interesting, but doesn't have a ton of use cases. His dash is trash, unfortunately. His magic regen is pretty bad, I think. It's a little quirky since it makes you take less damage, you know what I mean? But I think the attack and special, at least, are kind of fun if you decide to just do a build with it, basically. Not to mention, I think they did his duo boons right, for the most part, because I think his duos are quite fun when you actually get into the Kling Clang Ding Dong stuff, you know? I think they actually found a way to kind of make them quite interesting and make you kind of want to do it, even if it doesn't really make sense to do it every run. His legendary is really interesting. It increases the level of your aspect. And it's not like a small increase usually. Sometimes it's like doubling the effects in some ways. It's insane, really. Each aspect has its own very specific bonus, essentially. So you're going to have to look it up. But yeah, it's usually really good for any particular aspect. So yeah, Hef is just really strong right now. Meanwhile, we'll go on to Demeter here. Now, Demeter. I know I'm saving Aries for last for us. Demeter. Demeter is not dissimilar to Hef. I kind of like seeing her more as a utility than anything, namely because I think her curse might kind of be one of the strongest in the game. Possibly, well, depends how you look at it. One of the most useful ones in the game. The freeze effect, stopping enemies in their tracks for a few seconds, is just really good. What you'll realize, especially if you take something like her cast, it's a big circle, freeze all the enemies. That way, enemies that have armor on them aren't really so much a problem. Hopefully you have enough damage to deal with them before they get unfrozen, thus you don't really care about them. It's not going to do as much against a boss, but bosses aren't the only threatening thing in this game, right? So I think she winds up being quite interesting here, where I'm pretty happy to see her half of the runs. She also has some really cool other boons that might be kind of niche at times, but do have their use cases. You got Weed Killer, increases your Omega attack damage. You got Steady Growth, which is sort of the new rare crop, which is a fun boon, but you kind of got to get it at a specific time early on in the run, probably there. Plentiful Forage, strange boon, but I guess it could be useful in its own way. I think some of her duo boons are really fun too. Her legendary, I'm not that impressed by it. It mostly got carried over from Hades 1 is what I would say. So I'm not as impressed by it. But it's certainly not bad is what I would describe it as. She does have a second curse too. So she's kind of useful in that way. But you can't proc origination with her 2 curses. Not anymore. You used to be able to. Now you need 2 curses from 2 different gods basically now. But yeah, I think she's pretty solid. You know, I find myself okay with seeing her basically. And now here comes the probably more contentious one for us for ourselves, or the one that makes me kind of feel bad, because I think in the last tier list, you know, people would kind of jump on poor old Hestia here because she winds up at the bottom. But like I said at the start of the video, I think that she's not that bad, you know what I mean? But someone has to be at the bottom at the end of the day, right? So if we're gonna make a tier list, someone has to be at the bottom. And I'm afraid it's got to be Hestia. And it kind of comes down to, I don't think her curse is the most outstanding. In fact, it's the most niche thing ever. Hestia is a god that you're either going to do a Scorch run or you don't want to see her at all. There's not really a lot of times where you want to see her where you're not going for a lot of Scorch related stuff. And the problem is Scorch just isn't that impressive. It's not, I wouldn't describe it as weak or even straight up bad. But I would describe it as not as impressive, especially when you have to compare Scorch to something like Blitz damage, you know what I mean? So her supplementals wind up being like Controlled Burn, which is kind of a fun boon, but very, very specific. And then she has a bunch of Scorch stuff. Her trash, his dash is trash, you know. Her magic regen is actually pretty nice. It kind of just depends on the build. You have to kind of think about it. Her cast kind of fits in, even if you're not going for a big Scorch build, because you can just apply Scorch to a group of enemies, basically. And I think Scorch is just kind of this thing that never really winds up going anywhere, unfortunately, in most builds. It does have a couple follow-up boons. The most unfortunate thing about Hestia, I think, is the fact that her legendary is really, really terrible. It's honestly, like, it's kind of bafflingly bad in my eyes. It's pretty much completely useless. It negates fire damage on yourself, and most of the time in the game, you're not really even around fire damage, unfortunately. Yeah, there are times, you know, and it puts these little lava patches on the ground, but it doesn't really deal any damage, so it's kind of like, what's the point of it? And it has nothing to do with Scorch. That's like her whole thing is Scorch, right? I really think it should have something to do with Scorch, you know? So Scorch does have a follow-up boon called Pyrotechnique that makes the Scorch deal damage faster. You can also get Air Quality, which is the infusion from Zeus that makes your Scorch damage tick slightly harder, but it's probably not really worth going for. That's a lot of setup for very little payout is how I would describe it. There's a couple duos that are kind of interesting, like the Demeter one that makes your Scorch explode. And that one's really fun. The problem with it is that you can't apply Scorch again right away after you proc Freezer Burn, which is the name of the duo. It's just like, well, why not? Scorch is just really strange in this game, is how I would describe it. It doesn't benefit from most damage bonuses you can get for some reason. It can't crit, for instance, either from Artemis boons or from Paraki the Familiar. So, you know, there's always this lingering question whenever I pick up Scorch. It's just like, okay, so now what do I do? Because as far as I can tell, most things don't really work with Scorch, you know? Nevertheless, I feel like when I do a Hestia build, you know, because again, you're either doing a Hestia build or you're not. Whenever I do a Hestia build, I have a pretty good time usually. It's just kind of fun to see the Scorch kind of go on, you know? But it doesn't necessarily always feel good, is how I would say it. So, thus, Hestia's on the bottom, but we get to move on to the finale. We get to talk about Aries, and I'll probably talk a lot about Aries in this instance here. So, Wounds is his curse effect. And it's kind of confusing if you're just seeing it for the first time here. In fact, maybe I should pull it up on old Hades game here real quick for ourselves. Forgive the overlapping music, though, for me, if you don't mind. Let me see. How do I make this show up? Okay, so Wounds. Your strike has plus 50 power when inflicting this, can be reapplied after 3 seconds. So the move that is applying Wounds will have 50 additional base damage. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. And And then you have to wait 3 seconds to get that benefit again. It doesn't sound very good, does it? It probably doesn't sound very good. So base damage means it'll get affected by, you know, other boons afterwards. You know, like if you got a chaos boon that buffs your attack or special damage in particular, that will benefit more so from something like wounds. But what's better is Ares' follow-ups, namely. So he does have a boon called Grievous Blow that has a chance to deal double damage to any enemy that has wounds on him. It's really good. I think an epic gets 20% chance, and that's separate from crit. You can crit and to get double damage at the same time. So if you have crit chance from Artemis somehow, you know, and then you get a Grievous Blow proc at the same time, oh, baby, 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 it stacks up. It stacks up. It's really good. It's really good. I'm not going to lie, there might be some recency bias here with Ares, but why don't I throw him on the board here? I'm going to throw him in the low A's, because I find myself wanting to use him a lot right now. But again, I won't lie, maybe it is just because he's new to some degree or another, but this is my instinct, you know? But I think Wounds is quite a strong curse. I think it fits in really well and allows you to deal a lot of damage. I'm not that excited by his cast or his dash. They are unique in their own way. Well, the dash more so than the cast. The cast is a little boring, honestly. But they have two duos around them that, you know, makes it so the sword drops hit twice and then makes it so they trigger instantly. So I think that's interesting, at least. And just having duo boons that kind of work with the boons and stuff and aren't just general, like, take less damage or something like that are way more interesting, you know, personally. So I think they did his duo boons really well. He's got a really good duo boon with Poseidon as well. And his legendary is quite fun. I was quite smitten by his legendary that would allow you to collect blood drops, which is a whole nother mechanic that he has. And you would you would collect them instantly and automatically, and it doubles their effectiveness. Blood drops give you plus 1% attack speed and move speed when you collect them. You usually get them from certain boons. There's a revenge one. There's one where you can make blood drops drop from enemies that have wounds, for instance. So blood drops, at first, I was very impressed by. And now as time has gone on, I found myself not really enjoying their use as much anymore, or rather not finding them as useful. It was really fun to kind of experiment with them, see how high I could get the blood drop number, and see how it works with this weapon and that weapon. And then as time went on, I realized kind of like, yeah, it's actually not that useful with a lot of things, unfortunately. Getting a ton of what they call strike speed, you just get diminishing returns really quickly. You just don't need a lot before you hit some kind of cap, it feels, or at least diminishing returns, where getting 80, 90, 150% attack speed, it just doesn't do anything eventually if you're using like the staff and you're trying to spam the attack button. There's this inevitable delay that, I don't know, I guess like you can't really circumvent no matter how much attack speed that you have. So I'm gonna guess like each weapon sort of has some kind of cap, whether it's a hard cap, soft cap, I don't know. But that's sort of how it feels. Nevertheless, the blood drops are fun, you know? I know that's usually my excuse for things that's my way of saying it's not very good, basically. But it is a fun mechanic, and I think his legendary is fun, too. But yeah, the main thing is that I think he fits in really well for an attack or special for any build. Some supplementals he has. He does have single illumination, deal more damage to a single enemy if they're the only enemy around. I think is the main one. He does have a really cool duo boon called Heinous Affront with Zeus that makes it so you trigger your Vengeance boon whenever you apply wounds to enemy, I think? Something like that. Yeah, I think it's something along those lines. Or no, sorry. It just has a 6-second cooldown on its own. It's actually really, really good. So, but the problem is there's only 2 revenge boons in the game, really. There's Divine Vengeance from Zeus and Light Smite from Apollo. Now, there's a sneaky little thing with Apollo's Light Smite. In the description, it says you deal damage in the vicinity. And when they say in the vicinity, they mean every single enemy in the room. So if you get Heinous Affront duo, and you get Light Smite from Apollo, you can start hitting every enemy in the room with Light Smite, basically, right away. It's quite silly, essentially. It's quite silly. So Ares, I think, fits in really well. I think he's a really enjoyable god. I like all of his mechanics for the most part, and I think they did everything right. I think they did the duos and the legendary well, especially there. And I think that's pretty much it. I mean, we could talk about Hermes here a touch. You know, he doesn't really fit in with the other gods, but they revamped some of his boons, so I think I'm pretty happy to see him. He has a lot of desirable boons now. almost some of which that are too desirable, so I find myself really forcing to see specific ones, but I mean, that's probably just because it's new, you know what I mean? Boons like Success Rate and Winner's Circle are really interesting. Winner's Circle doesn't always have great use cases. I'm kind of hoping they change a couple things. Not the Winner's Circle boon itself, but some cast boons that may or may not be affected by it. Right now, it just doesn't affect enough of the cast, I think, is the problem with it more so. So yeah, I mean, I can't put them on a tier. It just doesn't really make sense, you know what I'm saying? But there we are. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed my lazy Hades 2 God tier list for the Warsong update. Let me know what you think. Where would you put everybody? You know, what do you like about the gods? What don't you like about the gods? Tell me what you think. Like, subscribe, you know what I'm talking about. My name's Haelian. I make a lot of Hades content. I hope to see you in another video.